STI insights, just to broaden our policy ambitions from science excellence to economic growth, and the other bigger circle outside, which is societal need. We argue that there is need to find ways to embed R&D, research and development, in the both wider landscape of research, commercialization, and societal need, because this brings about inclusion, transparency, ownership of STI policy and practice, and this brings about to the value add of our concept, the knowledge systems innovation. So these are the common and established analyses of STI, the research and innovation systems that use different conceptual methods and use these standalone methods. And most of the time, what is revealed is the adequacy and patterns of investments, mostly for economic growth and academic excellence. And they also reveal research and innovation capacities and output. But for KSI lens, we have applied this approach to broaden out our analysis, because it incorporates different qualitative and quantitative methods, as you can see. But this helps us to understand the dynamics and actually the performance of knowledge systems in the different settings. So what are the key findings that we found out? Using this approach, we have found out that actually country mapping in the 3 countries revealed national distinctiveness, that each country is unique in their own knowledge systems. And most of the conventional or investments in ST&I, most of them it's R&D that dominate STI and the investment strategies. This is not bad, but most of the time we try and replicate what is elsewhere, and this is most in high-income countries, which are not relevant to the country's context. We also found out that there is lack of data to support the practical aspects of ST&I intervention. And because we lack data, it complicates the ability of countries to further evaluate and understand the impact of the current and even future investments. So, but our case studies actually highlights a lot of innovative and model approaches, which we call promising fringe. For example, the Rwanda case study on medicinal hub revealed a lot of informal sector, and investments actually need to be targeted towards that area. And so we did bibliometric analysis, and it revealed that there is misalignment around patterns of publications and ISDG, because we looked at the publication data for the last 10 years, and we noticed that a lot of investments has gone to 2 key sectors, that is the health and agricultural research. And this potentially excludes other important sectors. So what are the implications for our studies? That we need to redesign our investment strategies to, for different contexts. And we can do this through integrated and sustained approach to capacity building and, capability building and sustained capacities. And we say we need to revision our knowledge infrastructures. We need to revision how we evaluate success. And we need to revision how we measure, the knowledge systems metrics and dynamics. So using the KSI lens, we can try and imagine these knowledge infrastructures. We can try and create the connection between diverse actors and the new SDG knowledge infrastructure, and we can build capabilities in how we evaluate. So through imagining, through the KSI lens, I'll just give an example of what I mean by the different ways we can design ST investment. Don't mind about the crowded slide. It's just that we have so many ideas around how we can imagine our capacity to reframe knowledge and innovation processes. For example, we can strengthen our governance patterns in different platforms and add value to what currently exists. So how can we create evidence? So we can create evidence hubs for national interpretation of SDGs. One way is through strengthening, convening, and mediation function of our universities, that they can, target both social and environmental relevance and participate in co-innovation. And we can evaluate how we strengthen capabilities in terms of tracking local alignment or our research to SDGs. So this is how we support decision making. We need to strengthen policy and practice. And then through KSI, just reimagine STI interventions through our approach to recognize the different actors and knowledge innovation pathways. We can use KSI approach to open a range of relevant evidence and again bring more insight. So this can be a guiding tool of analysis. And then also rethink our knowledge dialogue platforms. So we draw greater diversity of stakeholders and advance the methodological advancement that combine both qualitative and quantitative data to track impacts of research and technology diffusion, just the way we have used. So how do we reorient then ST and I to achieve the SDGs? So these might be just the practical approaches. One is to reimagine the functionality of innovation hubs and learn from case studies on the promising fringes. And just also note that STI is really not about producing degrees and patents, yeah? And we need to orient the capabilities and capacities of science granting councils to address or for sustainable development, but really localizing and putting that in context. And also we can continuously think about how there is misalignment between current research funding and development of and the development of developmental impacts. And again, so there are just many. We have a lot more of the study, but for the sake of time, these are the key things I would just like to present how we can reorient STI to achieve SDG. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I can see people are now quite active on Slido. So lots of questions coming in. I'm going to ask from Slido a couple clarification questions that have been asked. So Francesco, what are the strategies that you would recommend to enhance the influence of science, tech, and innovation researchers on policymakers to release more investment on science, tech, and innovation? So the question is, what strategies would you recommend to enhance the influence of researchers on policymakers? Then a question for Pamela is around you talked about Ebola and sort of how the crisis presented an opportunity. So there's a question about how, Okay, so crisis provides an opportunity to align research with social media, but how is this alignment achieved in non-crisis situations? And then for Nora, there's a question about how we define knowledge systems and how we define innovation so that we ensure that we're talking about the same thing. So if you could give quick answers to those before we move on to the next session.
Okay, thanks. So what strategies can we use to increase basically funding for STI, correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or to enhance the influence of
for
researchers on policy.
Yeah. I think one of the things which is coming out across, actually not only Nigeria, but other countries we're working in, is the issue of the lack of a conversation about quality. Yeah? I think that starting a conversation on a national level about what quality evidence means and why it is important to have quality evidence being generated at the level of the system to inform debates about policy and the issues, etc. I think that is actually a very good strategy to prove that researchers are something different to add to the conversation. Because otherwise, there's no difference between a consultancy, between a researcher in a public university, between a ministry producing its own data. I mean, there's a point where we really need to have a conversation about quality. And there, I think, is the value of research-based knowledge that would come out. Yeah? And then you can, really build a case for the importance of keeping the sector thriving and active.
Thank you. And to address the question on how you achieve alignment in an uncrisis situation. The West African countries, Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia, are strengthening their system because of the crisis they recently had. But a good example that I want to provide is Zambia, where they have also reached a level of alignment, and this took long-term engagement with advocacy. But what is key in Zambia is that they generated local evidence. They conducted research on what is happening in Zambia, what are the studies that are ongoing, and what are the priority areas. And this helped them to develop their research priorities. So prioritization is key in this sector, but that prioritization should be informed by local evidence and sustained engagement with the champions and funders and decision makers.
I think more every other time we have presented knowledge systems and innovation systems, there's always this question. But for us, we think these are not competing frames, but actually frames that complement each other. And using the knowledge systems approach is just trying to broaden out our thinking around how we can incorporate other aspects, especially societal needs. And for us, we argue that the knowledge systems thinking brings about some aspect of directionalities and diversity, especially of actors, both formal and informal, who are often more than not actually left out of these other particular framings, either the research systems or the innovation systems. Yeah. So just broadening out our thinking. Thank you.
Sorry, if you could just say a bit more about, the question was around how you're defining innovation system versus knowledge system.
Yeah, so because I didn't want to really go into the nitty-gritties of defining innovation systems and knowledge systems, because I think that is not what it is, but it's about how we broaden out ideas and thinking and using this approach to, guide either analysis of investments, because most of the time and traditionally, investments have always been skewed towards research systems and innovation systems. And all of us are aware that the focus has not been societal goals and societal needs. So for now, it's just to open up the space to begin thinking about some of these other framings. Yeah.
I just wanted to add a footnote to what I said earlier about quality. Just to clarify that when I say that a discussion about quality can actually increase the influence of researchers, I'm not talking about excellence. Yeah? I'm not talking about research in Nigeria needed to align itself with the standards established, I don't know, in the UK or in Australia or in Canada. I mean, I think that's a separate discussion. I think the discussion that can really be useful is how do we want to define quality, right? It's not an issue of aligning a country, a developing country research system to international standards. It's about engaging with those international standards and seeing whether the current definitions of quality, including excellence, are useful to as we want to generate knowledge that is policy relevant. I suspect it's not.
Okay, great, thank you. So for the sake of time, we're going to move on to the next session, but I do want to acknowledge some of the questions that have gotten several votes. There was a question about whether we're going to share the slides, and yes, we will share the slides as well as the papers for the various presentations that are being presented here today. And then there are two questions here that have gotten a number of votes that I want to throw out to all of you for us to be thinking about as we go into our discussion groups in a bit. So one question is, why is it taking this long for African governments to appreciate and invest in science, tech, and innovation? And the second question is, how useful is it to make a distinction between social and health or natural science systems when the two need to work together, especially within the context of innovation? So those are really great questions, and I want us to be thinking about those as we continue with this and as we prepare to go into the discussion group. So let's give a round of appreciation to our presenters. And I'd now like to call the next two presenters, Mattia and Alex, if you could come up, please. So I've just been asked to ask you to speak a bit slowly so that the translator has time to translate. So a reminder to all of us who will be coming up here. So we've been talking a lot about research systems, and now in this next session we want to also think about how we can strengthen research institutions. So we have a presentation by Mattia, which is going to help us to look at the latest evidence on research capacity strengthening. And then from there, we'll have a presentation by Alex Eze based on a paper around thinking about new approaches on leveraging Africa's research capacity to achieve socio-economic development. So looking at what are the new approaches that can help us to be able to achieve that. So first I'll invite Mattia Foskey from Research Consulting.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to DFID for inviting us, and ACTS for organizing, and COSTECH for hosting the event. So I'm just going to present briefly the results of the first part of a study that we conducted for DFID. This is an analysis of the literature on research capacity strengthening interventions across low and middle income countries. And the second part of the study, which I'm not going to cover, but hopefully will come up in the discussions later, is about a needs assessment of 7 sub-Saharan African countries, and there's quite a few overlaps between the two parts of the study. So, as I was saying, the background to this is to review the evidence on strategies and interventions to strengthen research systems and research organizations in LMICs. The reason why we focus on organizations and systems is because a lot of the research that has been done in the past was focusing on training individuals as a research capacity strengthening strategy. And there's a bit of an evidence gap about the kind of higher levels of organizations and systems. And the objectives of the study were to learn lessons from past interventions, identify evidence of good practice, and fill gaps on systems level RCS interventions. So the study covered about 220 publications. I doubt the findings will be surprising to the room because most of them at least are quite well known. Just a point on the evidence base. There's a majority of the studies that cover African countries. Now we were tasked with looking at LMICs generally, but we found that actually the majority of the literature covers Africa. And the reason might be because most of the focus and the spending actually is going into Africa. So we also looked at about 50 research capacity strengthening projects or programs, and only 3 did not cover sub-Saharan Africa. The limitations of this study are partly due to the design and partly to the evidence base. Design-wise, as I said, we did not look at individual level or research level interventions. We prioritize English-speaking literature. We define LMICs by giving priorities to lower and lower middle income countries, so middle, and higher middle were excluded unless the study was especially relevant. And we looked at literature from 2008 onwards, but most of these studies were meta-analysis, which means they actually looked at previous publications, therefore the range and the length of the interventions that have been analyzed is pretty broad. the evidence base show that there's relatively little evidence on intervention evaluations. Much of the studies look at the concepts and look at potentially emerging lessons from interventions, but there's no systematic evaluation of what the impact of a research capacity strengthening intervention has been. And the literature tends to focus on unmet needs over successful models. So there isn't a clear message of what actually works. And whenever there are messages of that kind, they are heavily caveated, saying what works in one context might not work in a different one. So I'm just going to summarize some of the findings. The first cover research organizations, and the second cover research institutions at the national level. So in terms of research organizations, some of the challenges are that, particularly looking at universities, there's a tension between the vocational culture or educational mission of universities and the research function. There is a lot of demand, increasing demand for universities to actually be teaching oriented, to train the next generation of business leaders or policy leaders, and that places a lot of pressure on researchers to actually do both the teaching bit and the research function. There is little time for researchers, also because there isn't a lot of management support, so the individuals are struggling to undertake research. There's an obvious and well-known problem of brain drain, which means that researchers tend to be attracted by career opportunities in perhaps wealthier countries, and this happens even more in case of research partnerships. So when there are connections between southern researchers and northern researchers, those very often becomes gateways for talent to leave the continent or leave LMICs. And there's a problem of insufficient training. The second areas of challenges is management. So research management is not recognized as a legit or as a valuable profession in many universities, which means that universities staff often lack grant writing skills, financial management capacity, and research support capacity. And there's also an area of problems around research infrastructure. Obviously, research equipment, the labs are often lacking, but also very much the ICT, the internet infrastructure, isn't as well developed. Although there have been investments in many African countries to support the growth of digital infrastructure, this is often not enough to support research that is very data intensive and places researchers in Africa or LMICs at a disadvantage. So what are the opportunities for donors? The literature says quite resoundingly, there's an opportunity to support South-South partnerships between researchers as opposed to North-South, or perhaps South-North-South, where the northern researchers work as intermediaries between researchers and institutions within LMICs. And the value of that is that you build capacity and you retain capacity at sort of LMIC level, and you create more buy-in in the process of managing research and producing research that's relevant to local needs. The second, sorry, I can't see very well. The second is putting in place brain drain safeguards. Now, these safeguards aren't really safeguards in the sense that you cannot prevent a researcher from not trying to go to Harvard or whatever. But what you can do is actually think about what can be done for that researcher to continue to pursue a meaningful career after the intervention is over. And the third for researchers is to create research training capacity. So train the trainer, pretty much. On the management side, again, it's about sharing good practice and raising awareness of the importance of research management within organizations. Support the use of software within institutions to streamline processes, but also using software to provide training to research managers, using MOOCs, for instance, or online courses, where physical training courses are not economical. And finally, an infrastructure, there's quite a bit of evidence around the importance of helping university build their infrastructure, and particularly on ICTs, looking at doing so from an institutional perspective. There have been examples of interventions where essentially consultants have come in, have built an infrastructure, built some software that people didn't know how to use. It wasn't very much responding to the needs of the local organizations. And so that software then, after the program was finished, wasn't really used and became obsolete. So it really is important to create a dialogue and then to create systems that befit the needs of the organizations. So quickly on the national institutions, which is possibly one of the most challenging levels that we can operate in. Is this? Yeah, okay. The three areas are funding, institutions, and commitment. Sorry, the institutions should read national institutions. So as we know, the gross investment. Okay, I need to wrap up quickly. So there's a problem of funding which comes from national government not really investing enough in research and development, as we know. There's also a problem of researchers not being incentivized to pursue a career in research because of low wages, and the literature says also few physical facilities. And most importantly, fragmented funding between different ministries and different agencies, which creates confusion and reduces the amount available for specific research projects. So consolidation is important. For institutions, challenges are that the government institutions are very under-resourced often, so there's not sufficient staff. The staff often is not sufficiently trained to meet the demands of all the research actors. And then the third area is commitment, importantly. So again, there's this tension between research and many other policy objectives. And I want to invite the audience to think about this. I think there's an onus on us to really make the case of why research is important, but also to frame it in ways that the government understands. Innovation and research are not the same thing. Very often governments look at innovation from their instrumental perspective of what is the impact on the economy on solving social problems. And research very often is a bit too abstract for that. So we need to frame this in ways that actually strike a chord with policymakers. And I think with that, I don't have time to cover the last slide, so I'll just stop. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, we asked you to talk slowly, and yet we're asking you to stay within your timeline. Sorry, it's a bit confusing instructions. So next, we'd like to invite Alex Eze to help us to understand how we can transform these the sort of institutional landscape within Africa.
Good morning. Good morning. Are we awake still? Okay. Thanks a lot, Eunice, for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here because this is the type of conversation that we need to be having in Africa today. The only thing that saddens me is that I'm only here for today because I have to speak at the Nairobi summit tomorrow. And unfortunately, I have to leave later in the day. But I want to use the limited time I have to really lay out what I consider as some of the levels of thinking we need to be giving to this issue if we really want to move the conversation forward. Over the last 20 years, I've spent my time helping build institutions on the continent. The center that I led for that many years in Nairobi is today opening one of their newest training facilities in Nairobi, the African Population and Health Research Center. And over the last 12 years, we've supported more than 450 doctoral students across the region. But as you look at many of these activities, they are so small and tiny compared to the need that they raise on the continent. So the question, when I was leaving APHRC, was really around how do we transform institutions on the continent? What are the constraints African organizations face that make them continue to remain at that small levels of capacity year on? And that question is something we need to understand. So what did we do? We went ahead in our thinking to say, let's talk to the people that are leading these institutions to understand what it is that they are experiencing that constrains their growth and development. We also recognize that beyond the organizations, there are other people that are important in funding research, and many of these people are funders. We also want to talk with them about their experiences working with African institutions. When DFID funds whoever in the UK to work in Africa versus when they fund an African institution directly, how do those experiences compare? And over the course of last year, we talked to about 46 CEOs of leading think tanks. Some of them are university-based, government-affiliated, independent research centers across the continent, to their board members, and some of them are seated around the tables here, and I'm glad to see you all here. And we spoke also to funders, about 14 of them in different parts of the world, who are committed to working in Africa. The results of this work is published and is actually hosted on Center for Global Development website for public comments. So you can look at it, give us feedback on what you think about the recommendations that we've come up with. We hosted a meeting in February this year in Washington, D.C., where we brought the African leaders together with the funders, with different other partners, to look at the report and think about how do we move forward. So I want to summarize very briefly what we heard and what we have been trying to do since February as a result of what we heard from both the funders and from the African institutional leaders. For the African institutional leaders, and you can read the report, if you look at it, what comes out strongly is the fact that the current funding model is a key obstacle to building and developing strong institutions on the continent. The funding model creates these small amounts of money that are short-term and externally led, many times through multiple intermediaries. So by the time the money gets to the African institution, it's too small to actually build systems, to keep trained staff. So they are always having these revolving doors where people come in with little capacity. Once they are built, there are international NGOs working in Africa that can pay them triple times what they are getting. So we are constantly having to retrain and build. We cannot invest in systems. We cannot offer 3-year contracts because we have very limited short-term funding arrangements. And they felt that unless we change the funding model of investing in research on the continent, we are really unlikely to change the ecosystem of research on the continent. We spoke to funders, and they recognized that there are the current limitations of the limitations of the current funding models. But they do believe and see that there is quite a lot of many advantages of working directly with African institutions. For many of them, they think it is cheap, they are closer to the ground, and they understand the things that they are dealing with, and the solutions reside with them. But they also have constraints in working with the institutions. And part of it, one of them made the point that our board has mandated us to spend 75% of our total portfolio on African institutions. But our number one challenge is the size of institutions on the continent. When you're running a $200,000 annual budget, nobody is going to give you $10 million because it destroys the whole arrangement. So, but how do you move these institutions from this small size to a bigger place of engagement? So, we came up with 3 recommendations around the need to establish a multi-stakeholder funding platform that will bring different stakeholders together to create a certain level of funding at levels and scales that we've not even contemplated before. Let me tell you something. Whether you're a national institution, even if the government of Tanzania triples or quadruples your budget, it's so small to create the type of transformation we want to see. in institutions in Tanzania. David has mentioned this morning $150 million pounds. It is too small for the 54 or 55 or 56 countries in Africa and the thousands of institutions we want to support. No single funder, no single country has the resources and the capacity to do this alone. And therefore, the need for multi-stakeholder funding platform is critical. And we need to think about the current funding model that passes multiple intermediaries and only gets the change to actual implementers on the ground has not delivered development outcomes and will not deliver it if we continue to work like that. We need to find a way to create integrator-type organizations on the continent that can receive the big amounts of money and get majority of it to actually get to the actual work that needs to be done on the continent. And we need to find metrics and ways of actually measuring institutional capacity. What does it mean? It's not something you can go and buy a unit of it. It goes from human resources and leadership and governance to systems and processes to vision and the way you can keep to it or not keep to it. So we did all of this. And what did we end up with? Is an initiative now that we are working with the African Development Bank to see if we cannot raise $1 billion fund every year for the next 10 years. Led by African countries coming together to put their money into a fund that can support research and research institutions on the continent. And we can get, if we can have 10 of the 15 director generals of national councils seated here today to come together and agree to put $5 million a year for the next 10 years, that's $50 million. We can get funders to match it almost 10 to 1. You already have 600 million. We can get lots of the African money that is being seized every day all over the world, and there is none of them coming back here. We can get another 200 million from there. We can get the private sector to invest in this entity. And I tell you, we can get that. Coming together, we can achieve such a vision. And that's the level of thinking and scale we need to create a transformative change in the knowledge and research ecosystem in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mattia. Thank you, Alex. Alex, you always get us thinking. I think even people stopped going on Slido because everyone was listening and thinking, what does this mean? And how can we do this? And how can we achieve this? So that's great. So we'd like to thank Alex and Mattia for that. I think as we're going through the earlier presentations and these presentations, there's some themes, some things that are coming up, and we want you to bring all of that to the discussion. So I'd like to take a few questions from the room, since I know not all of you are on Slido, and I imagine there must be a few burning questions or comments. Anyone? Okay.
I wish to thank all the speakers for very stimulating, thought-provoking ideas. One of the things that we lack in Africa is implementation of governance. And very little has been said about how do we improve implementation of our own instituted governance system.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions and then we'll come to them. Okay, this one there.
Thank you. Just a quick question for Alex. I just wanted to know whether you're referring to research funding or research capacity building funding. Because I think the role of intermediaries in those two is very different.
Okay. Oh, now the hands are coming up. Okay, one here. Okay, so we'll take those two others and then we'll come back.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that presentation. I just wanted to mention that several years ago, or actually many years ago, the idea of an Africa-wide funding mechanism for research, development, and innovation was floated, discussed, and actually agreed. And there were several very high-level meetings attended by Africa President by African presidents. The idea was actually to establish that fund at the AFDB. The initiative, actually it was a very high level initiative, and unfortunately it didn't gain enough traction. So I think it would be useful to ask ourselves, what were the lessons? Why did it not get traction, the traction that it needed? But it was an excellent idea in which some of the funders agreed to put funding at the ADB to be used by countries, and based on some of the debt that's owed to those countries. So instead of paying back the debt to those countries, part of the percent will be put in a common fund for research and development. So I really would urge us to think in terms of what did we learn, what were the challenges, and why did that fund not take off as was originally designed. Thank you.
Okay, so two more. So there was, I think it's Patrick at the back and Hannah, and then we'll come back to.
Thank you, speakers. Mine is a comment. I think when you look at the issue of trying to have countries, African countries, own their own solutions, it has to begin from the top. And Africa, we are blessed that we are so diverse. And so are our different heads of states. So the question is, I come from Uganda. My president, His Excellency Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, is his perspective about research and innovation the same as His Excellency John Pombe Magufuli? If all the 54 member states are not going to be on the same level in terms of thinking and how they think about research and innovation, then a common strategy cannot work for Africa.
Okay, Hannah?
Thank you. I wanted to ask Mattia, or make a comment to Mattia. Oh, I hope you can answer a question. I'm here. You mentioned brain drain, and I think at this time in the game, it's about time we nuance what we're talking about when we're talking about brain drain, because for many years it has been very almost stigmatizing. And I would like to hear your nuanced version of the statement.
Okay, great. So I'll come back to Alex and Mattia if you have any responses or comments based on those questions.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you all for the questions. Very quickly, maybe I'll take 2 or 3 of those questions very quickly. In terms of the African heads of states being different and having them come together, I think they say there is an African saying that says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. But if you want to go nowhere, you go with everybody. So we are not looking to go with everybody. We are looking to find the 10, 15, whoever, who are willing and already on the pathway to moving forward. And then let them create that environment that others will begin to see the value of investment in research. And they can emulate that. So that's really our strategy. The African research, what is it going to fund? The $1 billion. If you have $1 billion to support research, it will do 4 things. One is that it will fund meritorious research programs and systems and invest in institutions and whatever that is needed to make it run. It will support capacity development of researchers and leaders of these institutions. It will support the translation of research into products, into policies, into practices, and the whole ecosystem that moves from innovation to actual practice and products. And it will create an advocacy mechanism to actually make research better appreciated by the leadership and by the private sector and by different stakeholders within the country. So it will be, and the final thing it will do is create a mechanism for Africans in diaspora and different other areas to reconnect with whatever is going on the continent and support that work. I think these are strategies that many other countries that have strengthened their national systems have done in the recent past. And I think each of these areas will require investment. And finally, what has been done? Yes, a lot of these things has been tried, and we are currently working with the African Development Bank, the African Development Institute, and as we speak, they're actually having a concept note that they're discussing with their board about the implementation of this. And my challenge is to the DGs of the National Science Councils. What are you going to do? Are you going to stay on the sites and let these things pass? Are you going to come together and say we can actually be the vehicle through which the national investments into this particular type of initiative can happen? Thank you.
I'm going to talk faster now. So 3 questions. How do we improve implementation and governance? It is a very, very difficult question. Clearly, there are problems in terms of government effectiveness, which affect pretty much all policies. I think what we need to reflect is what is the real buy-in of the government when they are publishing a policy or when they have an SDI strategy. Sometimes these are developed by consultants, international consultants. There isn't very much a desire to see through the policy and to support it the way it should be. But also the realization, as you're saying, that there is a lack of capacity sometimes to implement these big strategies is in itself an advancement, because then the focus is how can we build that capacity? How can we build that capacity within government institutions? So connected to that, there's a question about whether people within a government or the different government agencies share the same vision about what is research and what is needed to support it. And I think the answer is, as you said, probably not so much. And one thing that has emerged already today is what do we mean, how do we define research and how do we define innovation, and what is the boundaries between two? Some countries actually support the SDI agenda by actually looking at technology adoption and looking at research that's been developed elsewhere and how can it be used in this country. Whereas all the stakeholders focus more on producing new research or nationally relevant research. Now, these are complementary objectives, but they're not quite the same. So actually creating a shared vision and having an understanding of how research and innovation support development at the highest level is very, very important. And this can only be done through communication between different ministries and between different stakeholders within a country. And finally, on the issue of brain drain, yes, brain drain is a bit of a cliche, but if you look at the number of researchers per million people across Africa, it's a fraction of what it is in wealthier economies. So there is an issue of not enough researchers. And when you have talent, a talent pool that's relatively small, and some of those researchers are attracted by opportunities abroad, then that problem is still quite relevant. So the issue is not about preventing people, researchers from low and medium income countries from going and collaborating or working in Europe or North America. It's about can they come back and bring those experiences back to their own country? Are there opportunities for them to continue research in their own countries? Or are they actually coming back and finding, no, I want to stay in Europe and North America because the support is better, because the funding is better, etc. So it's a big challenge, and I think the cooperation is important, but creating paths for people to come back and really use this expertise is probably more important.
Great. Thank you so much. So round of applause for Mattia and for Alex. So now we move on to the last session before we get into the discussion. So we've looked at some of the emerging evidence, we've heard some of the recommended approaches, and now we want to go to what are the opportunities, what are the policy opportunities. So we have a panel that's made of sort of the various types of stakeholders that we represented in the room today, and this is going to be facilitated by Ernest, RTA, who is the Secretary General of the African Research Universities Alliance, or ARUA. So I'd like to invite Ernest, and also the speakers could start coming up. Alphonsus Neba, African Academy of Sciences; Tade Aina, Partnership for African Social and Governance Research; Alexandra Spittle, UKRI, UK Research and Innovation; Mamadou from the Senegal Science Granting Council; and then Campeta Nyonza for the National Industrial Research Development Authority in Rwanda.
Thank you very much, Eunice, for inviting me to join this panel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ernest Aite from the African Research Universities Alliance, and my task here is basically to keep these men and women in check. I know they can get quite excited and do many different things, but you know, they chose somebody big like me to make sure that everybody's in check today. I'm going to ask each of them to take a minute to introduce himself or herself, just a minute, and then we'll see how we'll tackle the issue of identifying various policy interventions to address some of the issues that have come up. So let's start with you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alphonsus Neba. I'm the Deputy Director for Programs at the African Academy of Sciences. I also double as the Program Manager for one of our major programs called Deltas Africa.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Alexandra Spittle. I come from UK Research and Innovation, which is a government-funded funding agency from the UK, and I work in the International Development Team, mainly on our Global Challenges Research Fund and the Newton Fund.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Stds Akinyaino. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research, based in Nairobi, Kenya, but working out of about 20 African countries.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Mamadou Sy. Donc, je travaille au ministère de l'Enseignement supérieur, de la Recherche et de l'Innovation du Sénégal. Je suis en charge des stratégies et de la planification de la recherche. Sorry, but I will speak in French, so you need to...
Good morning. My name is Kampeta Sainzoga. I'm the Director General of the Rwanda National Industrial R&D Agency, and spent more than 10 years in the Ministry of Finance, including being the PS of Finance. So I want to show you both sides of the coin.
Thank you all very much for the introductions. Okay. So we're going to start by focusing on some of the things that we've heard today and also from our own experiences. Each of you clearly has been selected largely as a result of the background that you have and the kind of experience that you bring to all of these debates. One of the things that we got this morning from Nora's presentation and from the others is the fact that there are a number of key public and private actors in this space here. There's some evidence of some informal operators also getting in there. So there's quite a mixture of things happening in this environment here. What are some of the practical policy opportunities for enhancing investments in this area, strengthening linkages and so on? All of you have been quite involved in this. Maybe Kampeta will give us some opening remarks on this, based on your experience from Rwanda. Yeah.
So good morning, everybody. I'll start with a joke that we used to have at the Ministry of Finance when the Ministry of Health used to come and tell us that they needed money to save lives, we used to tell them that, traffic police also saves lives. So in the context of resource mobilization, everybody saves lives. That is how it is. When you want money, you always argue for either economic prosperity or saving lives. And the reason why I wanted to start with that is because often when there's a debate or a discussion around policy for science and technology and innovation, we tend to assume that everybody understands how R&D transforms economies, and it seems to be a linear kind of correlation. But the data actually doesn't support that. The data shows that there's no linear correlation between R&D and growth. What makes the difference, what translates R&D into economic growth, is a middle section, which is basically the capacity of economy and economic actors to absorb this R&D and transform it into either new processes or new products. And we often forget this missing middle. And unfortunately for us, the Ministry of Finance never forgets this missing middle. So as people who are involved in academia and in science, I think we need to develop a more sophisticated argument about how we connect to this missing middle. And the missing middle is the private sector. To what extent we invest a lot of energy, a lot of, I would say, attention to knowledge creation, but we don't invest the same amount of energy and attention into knowledge absorption. And I think this is the missing middle that we rarely talk about. And in conferences like this, where we are today, it's important for us to look at how does the knowledge that we want to leverage, that we want to create, actually get absorbed by economic actors. And very often, that linkage is very weak. They are very weak because the capacity of our firms to absorb new knowledge and transform them into product development is in itself very weak. Our companies tend to see innovation as a business risk as opposed to a business opportunity. If you look at the actors, the economic actors that we have in our economies, typically in Africa, they've developed a product, they've made money from that product, and they are happy. Until they get disrupted by external actors from India, US, China, they will not change that product. They will not invest in that product. So how do we make the link, and that's the job that my agency now is invested into, is how do we make the link between STI and product development for the private sector? And when we speak that language, my personal experience is that donors start to listen through a different ear. It's not the ear necessarily of education, but it's the ear of private sector growth. Ministry of Finance starts listening to us differently. Once we start being able to show private sector actors, local companies that have benefited from STI, it changes the conversation at the donor table. So I wanted to use the few minutes that have been given just to put that point on the table and to say, let's talk about this missing middle. Now, my last point is around public policy and how can we make sure that research feeds into public policy? Because I think one of the biggest frustrations of researchers, at least that I've seen in Rwanda, is when they do all this work, they get funding, they do research, and that it ends up on the shelf of some lazy bureaucrat. So how do we make sure that the research that is being done, whether it's in social science, whether it is in other policy environments, actually translates into policy change? I think the first one is how do we constitute our research teams? To what extent do we involve the policymakers? Policy, earlier on I talked about how our businessmen or businesswomen look at innovation as a business risk. The same way that our directors of planning look at new research, especially donor-funded, as a risk. Because some of our countries have unfortunately been affected by very bad advice. Just for a little, very short story, when we started giving health insurance for all in Rwanda, the World Bank had a cross-country study that showed us how this was the worst idea ever. And they had a whole list of countries, Costa Rica, Ghana, so many, many countries, basically showing with evidence how this was a bad idea. And at the time, our president said, I don't want research. My gut feeling tells me we need health insurance. You finance, get money, get it done. Now, we had to do a pilot, but now if you look at where we are today, 90% of our population has health insurance. Meaning that sometimes, if you're not careful, your directors of planning can actually look at research as a risk rather than an input. Now, the best way to handle it, I think personally, is to involve if you're talking about health research, involve the senior officials from the Ministry of Health into the design of the research, involve them in terms of the timing. Sometimes the research comes out at the wrong time. The implementation cannot take place through the budget. And then be very careful about the question that you ask, because that will determine the answer that you also give the policymakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Campeter. So clearly, there's a lot that can be done to deal with that missing middle that you are talking about. Now, let's go to how to make that practical. And Alfonso said, you have certainly been where you are forced to do these practical things. Can you share some of this experience with us very briefly? And then Mamadou can also do the same thing.
Okay. Alex did mention this morning about creating a multi-stakeholder platform where governments, the private sector, and even individuals could...
Maybe if I may just add to my question, I want you to try and tell us how, not just the practical side of it.
Getting there.
But also the making sure it is within the local context,
yes,
useful, relevant.
Yes, and that's exactly where I was heading to.
Good.
And that example is what we have created, we established at the African Academy of Sciences that we call the Coalition for African Research and Innovation. So this body brings together our funding partners, Wellcome Trust, DFID, Bill and Melinda Gates. It tends to bring African governments and the private sector and others to try to attempt to solve this problem where African governments and Africans as a whole don't contribute as much as they should in order to fund research and development on the continent. So it's a work in progress. I have my colleague here, Vani Naika, who could talk more about the exact steps that we've taken in order to do this. So that's one practical example that I could share with the audience.
Thank you. Mamadou, you want to try the same question?
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je pense que l'expérience sénégalaise, en fait, par rapport à la question de recherche-développement, le gouvernement du Sénégal a fait l'option d'investir sur le capital humain. Donc, depuis 5 ans, nous savons que, j'ai aimé tout à l'heure le débat qui a été animé par ceux qui nous ont précédés. C'est important de financer la recherche, c'est important d'investir dans la recherche-développement, mais ce qui est aussi important, c'est de savoir quelles sont nos priorités. Est-ce que les Africains, les pays africains définissent clairement leurs priorités, les objectifs à atteindre? Ça, c'est vraiment l'élément de base, parce qu'on ne peut pas demander du financement sans savoir qu'est-ce qu'on va faire avec tel financement-là. C'est ce qui explique en grande partie la faiblesse en fait des taux de décaissement de l'argent mis par les banques africaines ou bien par la Banque mondiale. Donc le Sénégal, comme je disais tantôt, a choisi d'investir sur le capital humain depuis bientôt 3 à 4 ans dans le cadre de ce qu'on appelle le plan Sénégal émergent. Donc il y a 3 axes. Donc le premier axe, c'est la transformation structurelle de l'économie et de la croissance. Le deuxième axe, c'est le capital humain, la protection sociale et le développement durable. Et le troisième axe, c'est la gouvernance, les institutions, la paix et la sécurité. Donc, je mettrai l'accent sur le deuxième axe qui a trait, en fait, au capital humain. Donc, notre ministère de tutelle, c'est le ministère de l'enseignement supérieur, de la recherche et de l'innovation. Donc, nous sommes un acteur majeur, en fait, de l'axe 2. Donc, ce que nous sommes en train de faire, c'est d'essayer maintenant d'aligner les formations au sein de l'enseignement supérieur avec les priorités de l'économie. Parce qu'il ne sert à rien d'avoir des universités qui restent dans leur monde à part et qui, du point de vue de l'impact économique et social, n'ont aucun rapport avec les politiques publiques. Donc, il faut un alignement maintenant de la formation, des formations de l'enseignement supérieur avec les besoins de l'économie. L'autre élément, c'est de définir clairement comme priorité, depuis 5-6 dernières années, la priorité est accordée aux sciences et technologies, aux sciences de l'ingénieur et aussi à la recherche appliquée. Nous savons pertinemment qu'au lendemain des indépendances, les formations des formateurs ou bien les sciences théoriques ont été très développées. Mais il est maintenant question de faire au moins de la science qui a un impact sur le devenir des populations. Et ça, c'est un aspect très important. Autre élément important, c'est notre partenariat avec le Rwanda, avec l'Éthiopie, dans le cadre du PACET. C'est un partenariat qui vise un peu à vraiment avoir un impact donc, sur le développement des talents pour la transformation socio-économique du continent. L'autre aspect important qui est lié à la recherche et développement, c'est la valorisation des résultats de la recherche et de l'innovation. Parce que l'Afrique se doit de mettre beaucoup l'accent sur la valorisation des résultats de la recherche. Même si ce pourcentage est faible, bon, il est très discuté, au maximum 1% de la recherche mondiale, mais il faut qu'on puisse valoriser effectivement le peu de résultats que nous avons. L'élément capital, parce que c'est très important, le financement de la recherche, quelle qu'elle soit, elle doit être assurée par les pays africains. Nous savons très bien que c'est stratégique. On ne peut pas demander à des bailleurs étrangers ou extérieurs en tout cas de mettre l'argent dans la recherche parce que, comme on le sait, celui qui paye, il commande. Donc c'est important que les pays africains, s'ils sont convaincus que la recherche en tout cas et l'innovation ont un impact dans le produit intérieur brut, dans le devenir du continent, il faut qu'on mette l'accent sur le financement et qu'on finance la recherche de façon conséquente. Et ceci est très important et je terminerai en mettant l'accent un peu sur l'importance. Nous savons tous que le continent africain, c'est un continent qui attire beaucoup d'investisseurs. Et je pense que les pays africains devront tirer profit de l'investissement direct étranger. Parce que ça, c'est très important. Il y a beaucoup de capitaux qui rentrent dans nos pays. Ça doit profiter aux populations parce que les gouvernements doivent mettre en place des stratégies pour capter le maximum, en tout cas, d'impact qui peut venir de l'investissement direct étranger.
Thank you very much, Mamadou. That's a very good summary of what could be done. Now let's turn our attention to the issue of external sources dominating the funding landscape here. And Alexandra, here, I would like to get your view on how to ensure, one of the problems that have come out is the fact that many of these initiatives are fragmented. But there's very little coordination leading to considerable inefficiency in the way we fund research and STR systems in this part of the world. How do we ensure that there's greater coordination? How do we ensure that countries are able to get out of the support the most that is available? How do we ensure that the support coming from outside takes into account the local context? Tadi, I'll ask you the same question.
So I think this is something that we are aware of in the UK, particularly recently there's been an increase in funding for research in Africa, and we are aware that there are now a number of different funds and different actors from the UK who are making an attempt to come together because we are aware that it is sometimes a confusing landscape. While we do want to come together and coordinate and try to make sure that everything that we are funding we can get the best value out of, what we don't want to do is limit opportunities. So while there are multiple different funds, I guess this in a way gives people multiple different opportunities and they can pick the place where it is most appropriate for them to get funding from. So what we try to do is ensure that all of our different funds are not just replicating the work of other funds. So instead of having 6 different places where you can apply for the same thing, we are all trying to kind of be a different part of the jigsaw, I guess, to make sure that we are kind of covering different areas. So funding for research systems, funding for capacity building, funding for standard research projects. So that's one thing I would say. Another thing is, so through the Newton Fund, this is a partnership with other governments, so it's a UK to African and other government around the world. So particularly South Africa and Kenya are Newton partner countries. And for those calls, we work with those in-country governments to define the priorities for what research projects we would be funding in partnership with that country. So that's to try and ensure that right from the beginning, when we think about what we want to fund in those countries, that we are taking that information from the local context and we aren't just kind of coming in and going, well, actually, we're really interested in this, which won't necessarily work in that context. And those Newton Fund partnerships are then a partnership between UK researchers and in-country researchers with matched funding from that country's government to try and ensure and leverage extra funding from African governments and encourage them to see the impact that that funding can have and how building capacity in their country in this area can be beneficial.
Thank you. David?
Thank you very much. My organization is Partnership for African Social and Governance Research, and the goal is to pursue excellence in the social sciences for public policy. I like to add both social sciences and the humanistic social sciences, including the humanities. With your permission, I'd like to actually, before coming to the nature of funding, deal with the question, some of the things that I think really do matter in the pursuit of what we've been talking about. I think context matters, and I think politics matters. We need to bring back politics into this discussion. And as a voice for the social sciences and the humanities, I feel it's important to reinsert that into the conversation. I'm glad you're here because I know politics matter. How do we then take advantage of what one calls policy opportunities? What is it that matters to governments? What is it that matters to national establishments? What is it that matters in such a way that people will rethink their politics of investment? And we've done studies just looking at urbanization and the politics of investment in urbanization. But let's put this back into the politics of investment in knowledge systems. The critical point here is about security, national security stats. And if you look, we have to look at who has made it, who has transcended. We look at India, we look at China, we look at Singapore. It's national security and competitiveness in several ways. If there's a threat, and I'm not speaking here because I recognize the social justice and human rights perspective, I'm not speaking here from the perspective of just national security as the politics of domination, but more about human security that extends beyond the politics of domination. So if we can interest our governments, we can interest the missing link, the business sector, we can interest the communities in our research through a focus on what really matters to our countries and to our establishments. And like Alex said, we're not going to get all the countries because some countries in Africa, as they are not even economically or politically viable. That's one fact that a social scientist will talk to you about and let you know. Some countries are not economically and socially and politically viable, but they can work as part of the greater mix. But very quickly, I want to come back now to your funding question because it's related. We need, if politics matter, yes, if politics matter, then we need to have a conversation in which our governments and our international funders and ourselves as different vested interests come to the table to understand what constitutes the priorities in which funding has to go into. And I think that's where the final point is, that goes beyond technocrats, that goes beyond scholars. We must see all of us as active citizens. And as active citizens, we need to build coalitions and alliances for investment in knowledge systems. And that is not about evidence alone, because it's also about belief. It's about ideology. And this is where the humanities and the social sciences come in. We need to move in terms of transforming or moving the pipeline, not only from evidence, but from a belief and commitment to the importance of that to build strong states, to build state capacity, to be able to transform our economies and societies, then you must have a belief and a commitment in the importance of science, technology, and innovation, and of course, the unity of the knowledges.
Actually, thank you very much, Teddy, for drawing our attention to that political angle. Indeed, my next question was also intended for you, but basically the point I want to bring out here was the fact that most of the funding that has gone into research systems around the region have tended to, as we saw in the earlier presentations, to focus on agriculture and health. So we know what Gates Foundation does. We know what Wellcome Trust does. We know what various other entities do for either agriculture or for health. What can we do to ensure that there are other very important aspects of our development, climate change, non-communicable diseases, even though it's a part of the health, it's not as important to the donors as infectious diseases are. How do we ensure energy, water, and so on, attract attention from the various funders, whether government or external? Yes, but briefly, I want to
Very
take
briefly.
that also to Alexander.
Thank you. I think it's about agenda setting, basically. And one interesting example, Ernest happened to have been one of the founders of PASGA, and he was our founding chair of our board. And he was also involved in a very significant network on the continent, the one on economic development and economic policy. And I think that's one area, the whole ARC and strengthening economic policy movement on the continent. I think one major element is the identification of a major need for the country. There was a need at that time, at the period of the economic crisis on the continent, to build capacities, both institutionally and individually, and within the strategic agencies of the continent in terms of economic reforms. That meant that there was a coalition of investors, both government, non-government, and international funders. That also meant that there was the need to build advocates and apostles. I'm using the almost evangelical term, advocates, apostles, and what you will call champions across the continent. And we've seen that after about 20 years now. We've seen governors of central bank, we've seen directors of treasuries, we've seen ministers of finance, we've seen young economists. Although, I have my questions about the nature of the macroeconomic theory, but I believe that basically that transformed the terrain completely, changed the landscape. And that is the issue. We need to identify those necessary, critical, and strategic levers of change or issues that are problems, the wicked problems, and climate change is very easy. We can see the flooding all over the continent. We can see the problems. We can see its relationship to food and nutrition. We can see its relationship to wars and conflicts. And I think that's why I said security is one of what I think a critical entry point now. And climate change is about human security. It's a greater threat to human security than, struggles between countries in terms of wars and all of that. And I think we can, again, we need to move beyond just advocacy. Advocacy as advocacy, it's really almost lifeless. When you talk about action based on coalition building, on movements, a movement, and I can see that the next Einstein Forum is beginning to build a kind of movement. We need a movement for transformation and for commitment to investment in science, technology, and innovation on the continent. And again, I keep saying, because we are moving to the era of the fourth industrial revolution, it is not only about science, technology, and innovation as we see it in terms of practice at the moment. It is actually the recognition of the unity of the sciences and the unity of the knowledges. The fourth industrial revolution created a differentiation between the knowledges. The fourth industrial revolution is going to bring back a unity and an integration between the knowledges.
Alexandra, your take on broadening the scope of support for research?
Yes, so I think, again, this is an issue that we're aware of. I don't think that I would call it a problem because obviously health is important and there is a long history of health research, and there are also a lot of funders that fund that research. I think the opportunity for us, particularly as UKRI, where we fund not just health but across all of the kind of disciplines, is to look at what the other funders are funding, where the gaps are, and so be able to spot those opportunities for areas where maybe there is less funding going into it and where there is an opportunity that in fact some extra funding in those areas could bring about big changes. And I think we have kind of started to do this, and there is the power kind of behind now the kind of communication and the globalization that we can see and talk to other funders and find out what they're funding. And we kind of have started to look at what research we're funding within the framework of the SDGs. So we can now see as a kind of spread across the SDGs, we put a lot of funding into this SDG, but perhaps these other ones have had less funding historically, and maybe we should think about putting some kind of targeted funding towards those areas. I think there's also an opportunity, as people have kind of talked about bringing in other disciplines, even into our kind of health research. So actually, I think to get the greatest impact out of the research that we are funding, we need to think about that pathway, the way that it goes from research, from academics into policymakers, and that middle ground that we've talked about, and how outputs get into the private sector and actually have an impact on society. And one way to ensure that happens is to bring social scientists and policymakers and kind of different ideas in right at the beginning of your research, to think about the way that you're designing it, to make sure from the beginning that you've thought about where it's going to go next and how it's going to have that impact.
Thank you very much. Alphonsus, let me shift gears a little bit to the Pan-African level. You heard Alex tell us about what the African Development Bank is considering. There's, of course, also the African Union, and then also the sub-regional entities like ECOWAS and others. What role can they play in this, trying to secure additional funding support for research?
Indeed, all these bodies have got a very critical role to play in mobilizing resources for the continent for science and science research and development. So as a matter of fact, they have a lot of political power, being that a lot of these organizations, they made up of government officials and other experts appointed by government. They have the will to be able to influence governments in order to mobilize resources for the continent. So if you take, for instance, the African Development Bank, they have the Excellence Awards that they make available on competitive basis, and you have quite a number of African universities that compete for these Excellence Awards. And it's actually a model that seems to work in the sense that it circumvents a lot of the pitfalls of providing funding directly to institutions, in the sense that institutions during this, in this particular model are able to spend money and then recover from this particular agency. And I think that's a very good approach in trying to influence the way that funding is also done on the continent. If you look at other levels, the whole idea of improving policies is also a very, very important one. I think these are the few that I could think of at the moment. Sure. But then again, one other thing that we could consider, or they could consider doing, would be the whole idea of being in a position to work with foreign governments in order to influence how issues like when you write off debts, how you do with writing off debts. Most of the times, foreign governments just write off debts, and we believe very strongly that these institutions could actually influence how this is done. For instance, you could write off a percentage of a country's debt in exchange for part of that money or that debt being invested in research and innovation. So that could be some of the ways that it could be of influence.
Thank you very, very much. Let me now turn to our audience. You've been patient. If you could ask a couple of questions or make comments, they'll be most welcome. Any questions from, yes, sir? As briefly as you can.
No problem. Thank you. Morning. I'm Remy Kirinjimana.
I wanted just to give a comment or a contribution on the opportunities we have now as this forum. I think we already have a major opportunity as people who are responsible for STI at policy but operational level, because at the continental level, unlike previous years, Africa has ever had opportunity to have a consolidated policy framework, which is TISA, the 10-year program started in 2014 with clear priorities and goals to be implemented in the next 10 years as part of the Agenda 2016, 2061, 63. And when you look at the SDGs, unlike other continents, Africa has been given a special consideration that SDGs should be focusing on Africa and in responding to the African Development Agenda 2063. So I think it's our responsibility here to align our national priorities into those global and continental priorities to ensure that our countries are able to fund STI. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Bitrina Diamet from Stipro in Tanzania. Let me actually thank the panel. I think even the presenters before the panel, what is in front of us, the subject is actually of great interest. I just want to draw the attention to a research area which I feel like it is basic and most important, and in most cases it's not really talked about, and I think it's least funded. Research about building African economies. We talk about health, yes, it's okay, environment, that is very important, but very little about, because that is basic. Government need to have money, isn't it? To have money to fund research, to fund health research, to fund research on environment or whatsoever. But without building African economies, we cannot really talk about priorities in any other research. And I think we are forgetting about this. And basic is the private sector. We don't talk about our private sector. What challenges are they having? When you are talking about innovation, we don't talk about challenges of innovation in the private sector, because it is the private sector that is, we have said so many times, is an engine of growth, and we actually overlook research in that. And I think when we talk about priorities, that should be top.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the speakers. I'm Shem Wandega from University of Nairobi. I want to introduce A in STEM, arts and humanities. Let us look at the production of our education system. The majority of the graduates are in arts and humanities. Secondly, when you look at STEM, STEM is alien to our culture. Without bringing A into STEM, we are not emphasizing the role of culture in our system. We have to begin to appreciate that without understanding our culture, we are not going to go anywhere. Thirdly, as a chemist, I find myself incapable of explaining what I have done to the people. But if I can communicate with my arts and humanities colleagues, they will be able to communicate what I have done much better than I can, because my thinking in science is restricting my vocabulary expression. And I want to support you for emphasizing that you cannot progress without adding STEAM, A to the STEM.
Thank you very much. That's a very bold statement from a chemist. You know, I see your hand up, but I'm struggling to get Eunice off my back. You know, so just forgive me for not being able. Let's talk during the coffee break. I'm going to give each of the panelists half a minute. Half a minute, and I'm going to be very strict with that. So let's start with you, Campbell.
Thank you very much.
Respond to anything that you want to respond to.
I'll just half a minute. I
Yes.
think from a colleague from Nairobi, arts and humanities versus STEAM with the A. I totally agree with you, sir. The only thing that we need to be careful, in Rwanda we've pushed very hard for STEM. And now about 60% of the kids who go to university are in STEM discipline. If we don't handle the issue that the lady with the pink jacket has handled, you end up with high unemployment in STEM disciplines because they don't find employment in the country. So just to say that I think the 2 points are totally connected. We need to drive the private sector to absorb innovation and to be able to have enterprises in science and technology, but this cannot, it's like the chicken and egg. This one cannot happen without this one, but if we only focus on this, which at the beginning we did, then you end up with just a higher number of unemployed STEM. So balancing and linking the two is crucial.
Merci beaucoup. En fait, je remercie aussi vraiment les contributions qui sont venues des différents participants. Je pense que c'est important et j'aimerais insister là-dessus. C'est important que les gens travaillent sur des priorités clairement définies. Ça, c'est très, très important. Les pays africains ont l'African Union comme association commune qui a clairement défini dans l'agenda et dans STISA 2024 un certain nombre de priorités qui peuvent être déclinées localement. Ce qu'il faut faire attention, c'est que les priorités au niveau mondial sont articulées depuis quelques années autour des objectifs du développement durable. Mais à côté, on peut avoir des priorités locales, c'est-à-dire qui ne sont pas dans l'agenda global, mais chaque pays a ses priorités locales et qui sont des priorités élémentaires, je qualifierais, sans lesquelles on ne peut pas avancer. C'est-à-dire les questions d'énergie, les questions de One Health maintenant, parce que quand on parle du climat, on touche pas mal d'autres questions. Ça, c'est important. Donc l'alignement de ces besoins nationaux à ceux du continent, évidemment avec la question lancinante, et Madame l'a rappelé tout à l'heure, de l'économie. Parce qu'on n'a pas en Afrique de véritable ministère d'économie. Attention, économie, ce n'est pas le ministère des Finances. L'économie définit la stratégie, définit la vision et corrèle à ça les moyens. Nous savons que l'économie africaine, pour la plupart, c'est une économie informelle. Il faut des recherches de ce point de vue-là pour l'adapter et non se caler au schéma mondiaux, en tout cas de classement des différentes économies. Ça, c'est très, très important. Et ça, la recherche sociale peut y aider. Et je terminerai, en tout cas, en parlant un peu du secteur privé, parce que c'est important que l'Afrique ait un secteur privé fort. Parce qu'en parlant de la recherche et développement, ça suppose qu'on a des entreprises, on a des industries qui sont capables, en tout cas, d'avoir ce dialogue avec le monde de la recherche. Malheureusement, c'est très très faible, le secteur privé. Il est assez faible. Il demande à être renforcé et cela, c'est vraiment une donnée capitale.
Thank you. We live in a knowledge economy, the era of knowledge economies and societies. And it is imperative that if Africa does not want to continue as a site of redundant labor, exporters of natural resources and labor, then we need to invest in our knowledge systems. And to invest in our knowledge systems, we need to build coalitions and alliances, both within the continent, within our countries, and internationally, for investment and transformation of our knowledge systems.
Thank you. Alexandra?
I mean, I think I would like to reiterate what the rest of the panel has said, and I agree. I think that thinking about the kind of contribution of STEM and the arts and humanities and bringing these things together will increase the impact and contribute to the economies of African countries. And I would also like to emphasize that I think thinking about these things in the kind of knowledge systems that we were talking about earlier and how we can bring all of these things together and then think about how they feed into the private sector will grow the economies and be very important.
Alphonsus?
Yes, we believe very strongly at the academy that the arts and the social sciences and humanities, they play a very, very important role in improving our socioeconomic development. And I think for this reason, we are actually in the process of trying to implement a social science and humanities program alongside based on the pillars of our core program, which is the Delta Africa program. So I think it's in recognition that we could do better as a society if we revive the arts and the social sciences in research leadership and capacity development programs on the continent.
Thank you very, very much. I think the only way I can summarize what we've done this morning is to say that there's consensus that working together we can achieve a lot. Working together we can expand considerably the inflows available for changing the system. Working together, bringing the private sector and the public sector together with the external sources, we can considerably expand that. And even among the researchers, we need to broaden the collaboration between the STEM subjects and the other subjects, so including the arts and humanities. So I like moving from STEM to STEAM. How you make it practical will be the nightmare of every vice chancellor. So, having said that, having created new work for vice chancellors, we can take a break. Thank you very much.
Another round of applause. Thank you so much to all of you. Great. So I'm now just going to invite Joanna, who's going to tell us how we're going to go into tea break and how we'll move into the groups after that.
Okay, great. Good morning. I'm Joanna Chataway. I'm part of the Knowledge Systems Innovation Project team that Nora presented earlier, and I'm going to be facilitating the next session. So we've had wonderful presentations and a really stimulating, great panel discussion. A lot for us to think about in the next session when we'll be working in smaller groups. We've got lists outside which explain how you've been allocated to groups. We've done it by institutional affiliation, so if you're in SGC, you're in one group, if you're higher ed and think tanks in another, so on, and also by alphabetical order, your surnames, the first letter of your surnames. So you might be in SGC 1 if your surname begins with A. And we'll have the lists up, we'll project them up, and they're outside also. So when we come back, look for your table. Tables 1, 2, 3 will be in that half of the room, 4, 5, 6 over here in this half of the room, and we'll be around to help facilitate the work in small groups. We'll draw on what we've heard this morning already, and we'll have some questions to guide the discussions, which will be on each of the tables. So I hope that's clear enough to get us to where we need to be in the next session. And if you could, because we're running a little bit behind time, if you could bring your tea and coffee back into the room so we can get started quickly, that would be great. Thank you.
So, yes, I left it here.
So, excuse me, it's just a password. So we just... You were the ones who brought it, and it's the hotel.
Hotel?
Yeah, they said we can only use this laptop, so I don't know who the hotel is.
Hotel.